true. Sometimes funny, sometimes it's sick.
Greetings and welcome to the Department of Tangents podcast, episode 37, a conversation with comedy writer Mike Sachs, featuring new music from Randall Thornton. I am Nick Zano, the host of the show and the guy who writes all the blog posts on the Department of Tangents. I never introduced myself, but I figured after 36 episodes, maybe I should start doing that. I also usually stick to the interview subject and the featured track in my intro, but I wanted to mention a couple of things before I got started here. First, as I'm doing this voiceover, Hurricane Harvey still isn't finished with Houston. I have friends and family down there, and I've seen how devastating this has been to them and through them. There's been a lot of damage, and they're still working on releasing water from the dams to try to control the water levels. There are a lot of people hurting. I just wanted to ask you, if you can, to find someplace to donate a few bucks to help out. I won't advocate any specific charity. There are lots of them online, but there are a lot of ways to help. You may remember a couple of weeks ago I spoke with Billy D. Washington on the podcast. Washington lives in Houston, and he's checked in and he's safe, but he's launched a GoFundMe campaign to help other people. A lot of people are trying to help each other out, and that's the only way this all turns out positive in any way. And on a completely separate note, we lost Tobe Hooper over the weekend. He, of course, directed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original and the sequel, and he's had a lot of wonderfully strange films over the years. He had his hands on Poltergeist, maybe his most high-profile work, but go back and watch Body Bags if you can find it. That's Hooper and John Carpenter, who's about to go on tour playing his music. And if you haven't seen the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original, in a while, and you're a horror fan, give it another look. I wrote about this on the blog last year. You might think maybe you're beyond the movie, that you've seen Saw and Hostel and all manner of modern blood and guts, and maybe the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre might seem a little dated to you. It's not. It's utterly terrifying. I watched it at 1 or 2 in the morning last year, and it shook me. Find a quiet night, turn out all the lights, and watch. Okay, so this week's episode, I am very happy to present a conversation with comedy writer Mike Sachs. He has a delightfully offensive gem of a book he's presenting called Stinker Lets Loose. It's the novelization of a cheesy action comedy Sachs saw as a kid, one of those weird B or C movies you'd watch on a Sunday afternoon, possibly on a UHF channel if you're old enough to remember a time before cable. Stinker is the name of the main character, a legendary road adventurer with a bevy of sidekicks, including a trucker named Boner, a chimp in heat, a buffoon, a rescued teenager with poor impulse control, and they are charged with bringing beer to the president, and they aren't going to let anyone stop them. It's great. We talked mostly about the book, but I got to talk shop a little bit as well. Sachs has a couple of great books of interviews with comedy writers called Poking a Dead Frog, and Here's the Kicker. He's interviewed Harold Ramis and Mel Brooks, Amy Poehler, David Sedaris, Dick Cavett, George Saunders, Dave Barry, Paul Feig, just a who's who of anyone who has ever written anything funny. And since my day job has been interviewing comedians for nearly 20 years for the Boston Globe and other places, I could relate to that. We got into that in the second half. And finally, after the conversation, stick around for a new song from Randall Thornton from his debut album Lineage. And now, Mike Sachs. So, what exactly is the Stinker series, and how did you first come upon it?
Well, it's just one of those movies that, there's a few movies that I remembered vaguely as a kid, and certainly pre-internet, I would wonder if I had dreamt it. You know, for instance, there was a scene in a movie I saw on TV once in which a princess, this took place in the Middle Ages, or maybe even earlier, it had to do with the Moors and Vikings, and it was a princess walking down a long row of military people, and she asked for one volunteer to commit suicide, and she ended up picking someone. He didn't really volunteer, and he slid down. He was forced to slide down this long slide with a razor in the middle, so he was basically split in half. You didn't see it, but you knew what happened. So I saw this as a kid and wondered, did I really see that? And a few years ago, I looked it up on the internet. I just happened to find it. And it comes from a movie called The movie with Sidney Poitier, featuring Moors and Vikings. So that was one of the instances of me saying, or seeing that what I had seen wasn't a dream. And then there was another movie that I saw as a kid, and I always wondered if it was either a conflation of other CB movies, trucking movies from the 70s, or it was something I actually saw. And it was featured a chimp who was in estrus, who would rip people's faces off, and the chimp was owned by a trucker named Stinker. And it also featured other aspects of 1970s culture. CB radio, Jimmy Carter was featured as a character, although you never saw him, and other things. And a few years ago, I went looking for it, and it's impossible to find on the internet. Can't even find, a copy of a VHS. And I would ask various people, experts like friends of the Onion AV Club, have you heard of this movie? And no one had heard of it. And I managed to track down not the movie, but the novelization in a used bookstore in Virginia Beach. It was really beat up. And the novelization is based off of the script. It's a movie tie-in. So I was reading this, and I just couldn't believe what I was reading. And it was just it was almost like from another planet. It was almost science fiction. It was so bizarre. So what I decided to do was start my own publishing arm to reprint old novelizations and old pop culture esoterica from the 70s, 80s, and 90s that has been forgotten. And this will be the first. This is from 1977, Stinker Lets Loose. The next one that I'm going to republish is a little-known movie from the early 80s, early to mid-80s, I think it was 83, about losing your virginity when those movies were big. And it also features a video game championship, and it's called Poppin' It. And not many people know about this movie, but it's one of those movies that I saw, too, that I just thought, did I remember this? And it turns out that, yeah, I did actually see this movie when I was really young, about a kid who goes down to Tijuana to lose his virginity and ends up becoming a champion video game player, complete with the video game gloves.
Well, it's every kid's dream.
The trophy and all that sort of thing. So that'll be next.
Did you find that one in the same store?
No. That one I found on A Books. I found out the name. I remember the name, looked it up on the internet, and then just typed in Poppin' It. And got the last copy. I don't think there are any other copies out. The thing about these books is they were so popular, but they were popular among kids, and kids don't tend to keep books. They just threw them out, I guess. So there's very few. Some of these novelizations, even though they were popular, are very difficult to find.
Well, it must be a relief to have found them. Otherwise, you would have continued to think, well, this is all just in my imagination.
Yeah, there's certain things that I kind of remember as a kid, like, and not just pop culture related. I remember going with my father once and it's almost too bizarre to describe. He took me to some giant hole that was dug in some suburban development near where I grew up in Maryland by a bunch of neighborhood kids, and the hole was huge. And there were like ramps leading down to the bottom of the hole. Now I asked my father recently, I said, did this happen or did I dream it? And he has no memory of what happened yesterday, let alone this. But I can swear that this happened. But it's the type of thing where you can't really confirm it online. Whereas if other people experienced books, movies, and such, there's always going to be one person, or typically always at least one person, who will be writing about it. And so you can sort of pinpoint it if you do the research deep enough.
Well, reading the book, it does remind me of roughly 60% of movies I would watch on a Sunday afternoon between 2 and 4.
Well, exactly. These are movies that enter the public domain after they showed in movies, or movie theaters, or in the case of Stinker Lets Loose, drive-ins down south. And then they would be purchased for really cheap and then edited. All the sexual and profanity would be edited out. But it would still leave plenty in. And then they would show them, in D.C., they would show them on Channel 20, or on Channel 5. Those are the two channels that showed weekend movies. And these movies were I don't think Stinker Lets Loose was, but, a lot of these movies, whether it's Smoking the Bandit or any of those CB trucking movies, were just shown on constant repeat in Maryland and Virginia, where I grew up, in the 70s into the 80s. But it's funny, in the 70s it was very rural Southern pop culture, but it seemed to then become urban North, with breakdancing, rap battles, those sort of movies, which I also love. But there seemed to be a sea change at some point, and they sort of stopped showing these movies during the day.
Well, they were horribly offensive. That might have been...
Well, they were horribly offensive, and, the politically correct attitude was not in place back then. So Stinker Lets Loose, and I mentioned this in the foreword, it's misogynistic, it tends to be racist, anti-Semitic, anti-homosexual, homophobic, xenophobic, anything that is not necessarily you'd want in a character these days, you would see back then, but it didn't stand out, it was just that time.
It was innocent.
And, a lot of Southern culture was not necessarily completely understanding of different races and sexualities and what have you that you can see now. So it's a good thing it has changed. But what I do like about this book is that it's sort of stuck in amber. It's like very much of its time. This is 1977. Jimmy Carter was president, and there were troubles. But compared with the troubles that are going on today, it seems so harmless and very innocent.
Well, and you found it just in time for the 40th anniversary of its original publication as well.
Right, well, that was another thing that just worked in my favor. I mean, I don't know if I would have waited. If it came out in 78, I'm not sure I would have waited and said, this is 39th anniversary and waited until 2018. But it was just one of those things that just locked into place, and it was like, wow, it's coming up on the 40th anniversary. So at that point, I tried to reach out to the author of the book, not the screenplay, but the author of the novelization. The guy's name was James Taylor Johnston, not Johnson, but Johnston. And very, very difficult to find any information about this guy, but I did find out through a relative of his. He's no longer alive. He passed away. But he was one of those writers who made a good living, and you could do this back then, just producing pulp. And it was either horror books. He wrote a few books about crabs attacking and other animals attacking, dolphins attacking. This was a big thing in the 80s.
Right.
But he made most of his money, he came from writing novelizations. It was mostly B or even C or D movies. I mean, a lot of these novelizations you would never have heard about, like Chucky Esposito on Mars. Have you ever heard of that movie?
No, I haven't. I would like to have heard of that movie.
Well, good luck finding it. I mean, the relative told me these names, and I looked it up. She may have been misremembering, but these are the names she gave me of the other books that this guy wrote. Dirty, Tricky Bicycle Daredevils. The Space Monkey Who Fell from the Sky and Caused Havoc. Dance Conspiracy. What else? Rascal. This was based off of the character in this book. She claims that he wrote a complete book. This wasn't a novelization. It was just a pure fiction book about Rascal the chimp and estrus, and the book is called Rascal Eat Baby. Roller Skating Rabbi, he wrote. The Caramel Flavored Popcorn Wars. The Candied Apple Gang. And Return to Crumb Mountain. Well, these are all these sort of like pulpy, bizarre books that this guy supposedly wrote. I would love to get my hands on them. But as I said, he passed away. He was sort of reclusive, lives in a one-bedroom condo in Los Angeles. He lost track of his family. And his stuff is out there, supposedly, in some storage unit, but no one knows where it is or where the key is.
Well, you would think with somebody who wrote so many popular books that you'd be able to find them on eBay or half.com or wherever, you'd think they'd be more plentiful.
I think that's going to change. I mean, I think, as they say, his time is due, whether it's for ironic purposes or other purposes. But this is a guy who struggled, did make a career, I suppose, out of writing pulp fiction and novelizations. But I think he's one of those people who are going to be rediscovered and just become huge. And I would love to republish his stuff. If anyone out there knows where to find this stuff, like especially Disco Conspiracy 2, if you can find any of this stuff, I would love to republish it, because I mean, just looking at this book, it's such a work of bizarre art. I would love to see what else he was up to.
Well, it's almost as if, obviously this isn't the case, but it's almost as if he wrote it to be a humor piece.
I don't know. I'm not so sure of that. I mean, maybe he did. Maybe he had designs to be a comedy writer. Maybe he was out in California to try to make it as a screenwriter and couldn't. There's a lot of mystery surrounding this guy. But I'm not so sure that it was comedy for comedy's sake. I mean, I think it was more like, the director of The Room. That was, he just produced, he wanted to produce something good, and it turned out bad. And then he sort of, he tried to play it off as if he was trying to make it funny the whole time. I'm not sure. I mean, regardless, I think the book is very funny, Stinker Lets Loose. And I think there are some asides that the writer made that I think were put there on purpose, but I'm not quite sure. There's a lot of mistakes in there, a lot of grammatical mistakes that are funny, and I'm not so sure that those are put in on purpose.
Well, at one point, I think Stinker is said to have looked suddenly cordite when he was supposed to be. I think that meant contrite.
That's right. And
but
also
it seems
phallic,
to fit.
instead of a phallic symbol, it's a phallic symbol.
Yes.
Like you would use when you're sewing. So stuff like that, I'm not quite sure. It's either really clever or it's an Archie Bunkerism that he wasn't even aware of. I don't know. The whole background about this guy is a blank slate, so I think you could put anything on it that you want to. But I think hopefully the book, whether you find it funny or not, is just entertaining.
Well, would you say that you share a comic sensibility with James Taylor Johnston?
I would say some people might say that, yeah.
Would you think there's any similarity between some of the humor writing you've done, for say, let's just say, and some of the funnier parts of this book?
I don't know if I like what you're implying. Are you implying that there is no James Taylor Johnston and I wrote this book myself?
I wouldn't imply that at all. I'm just saying that there are similarities. Maybe that's what drew you to his work.
Oh, I see. All right, I apologize for what I just said. Yeah, I think there are similarities. I think we share a very similar sort of sensibility, a humor sensibility. It's almost as if I were in my 40s in the 1970s, I might have written this book. I guess it's fair to say that, I think.
Mm-hmm. No, it's almost like it's a parody of something that would have been. I
know, it almost reads like it's like I wrote it pretending that James Taylor Johnston never existed, and it's a parody of a novelization from the 1970s. Stinker Lets Loose didn't even exist, that I hadn't seen it as a kid, and it came from my love for movies of that era. I can see where someone might see that.
Yeah. Or maybe you have bought up all of these books and destroyed them and then released this.
Well, that was where I was going next, yeah. So what I was going to say was I bought the rights to Stinker Lets Loose and then retyped it. So what you see is actual my typing, but not necessarily my writing, if that makes any sense.
Well, it's a fine distinction that people don't make often enough these
especially
days.
If you're not in the game. If you're not in the literary game, it might be too fine a distinction. But I think, if you're a professional writer, you might get it. Because what I did was I just took that writing, retyped it, and, as far as it becoming copyright, I now own that. It's a complicated thing, but it is something that I produced through the vessel of God that James Taylor Johnston was in the 1970s, if that makes any sense.
But do you plan to retype any of the others in the Stinker series?
Well, I do. The Stinker Strikes Back, I'm looking forward to. Stinker Goes All In. And Stinker Jump Giant Hole, I'm really looking forward to. That was a movie that came out only in Japan, and that had a lot of sexual context to it. The hole was a metaphor for sexuality in the late 1970s. It was a very large hole, and whether he jumps it successfully or not, I'll let that remain to be seen. But those are some of the exciting books that are going to be coming up that I shall be retyping for the future.
Where did you find the photos for this? I'm assuming they're all just taken from the movie.
Yeah, the photos are, I got in touch with a guy who works down in the archives down at the University of Texas. He managed to get the one copy, and then that was, he wouldn't even tell me who owned the original copy. Rumor was it was Quentin Tarantino, but he borrowed it and took shots, photos off of the TV where he was showing the movie, and those are the stills, the movie stills that you see within the book.
And some of them, it's strange, don't even seem to have a lot to do with the movie.
Right.
Some of the.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean that's true. I mean, like the picture the clown holding up the umbrellas, standing next to a weeping child. I'm not quite sure that was in the I mean, it had to be in the movie. But I think a lot of these, or the kids standing next to the ventriloquist dummies, I think some of these, there was a big blooper craze back then.
Yeah.
And if you watch Smoking the Bandit, and they always end with bloopers, and I think some of these stills came from those bloopers, like the caption of the guy wearing the pumpkin as a helmet, and then the caption reads, "Bang Bang Billy entertains everyone with his wild antics."
Mm.
I don't even know what that means. It has nothing to do with the plot, but it kind of works within the context of the bizarreness of Stinker Lets Loose.
Yeah, you wonder if there's a director's cut, perhaps.
I think there will be. I think, I'm hoping, if it is true that Quentin Tarantino owns the one copy, I'm hoping that he will put out commentary, because whatever he says is awesome. I just love whenever he talks about movies. He can just go on forever. I never get tired of listening to that guy.
Now, you're working on an audiobook version of this adaptation. Were you able to get the original cast to provide their voices?
No, they all died, supposedly. I mean...
All at once?
Yeah. I mean, John Hellman played Stinker, Bernard White played Boner, and then Rascal played Rascal. He was an actual chimp who acted out in Hollywood. Steve Wilson played the president. He played Jimmy Carter, whose face you never see, you just hear his voice. Daphne Doodle played the character of Little D. But all these people are gone or just out of showbiz. So what I did was I sold the book to Audible, to Amazon. And Eric Martin, a very talented producer, voiceover artist, is going to read the book with famous actors and comedians playing the various roles throughout. I cannot give away the name of the actor who shall be playing Stinker, but you have seen him on one of your favorite TV shows.
Now, if this were a parody, I'm not saying it was, but it's interesting the tone you have to take. You couldn't just write a bad book any more than Christopher Guest and Harry Shearer and Michael McKean could have just written bad songs for Spinal Tap. If you were to write a parody of this, it would take you'd have to get that tone right. It couldn't just be a bad book or
yeah, I see what you mean. I mean, if I did write it, I would have to spend a lot of time getting it so it was specifically bad, where there was a story and it was working on different levels of parody and satire, that sort of thing. It couldn't just be a load of crap. It would have to be a load of crap with a meaning to it, a purpose to it, and also a love for what I was satirizing and parodying. I can see where that might be accurate if I had written it.
Yes. There's some wonderful language in here. I wrote a couple of sentences down, or a couple of descriptions down. There's one sentence. Gwyneth, who is Stinker's love interest. This is one description of Gwyneth. Gwyneth is I can't even say it.
I know it's hard to do these words. James Taylor Johnson nailed it. It's almost like poetry.
Yeah. Gwyneth's thing was holding mewling, squiggly baby rats from failed strip mall pet stores and wondering whatever they could be thinking.
Yeah, things like that. You wonder what James Taylor Johnston could be thinking when he wrote that. I mean, my guess too was he was high on some sort of substance. I do
definitely
know drugs,
a substance,
but I can see the advantage of doing drugs as a writer at times, and I think that line is a specific example of if someone did a hallucinatory drug and just sat down and started typing.
Yeah, it's almost Terry Southern-esque.
Exactly. Yeah.
There's another phrase in here that I thought was interesting. He described Stinker's car as having a labia red Naugahyde interior.
Well, you said I described it as that?
No, he described it as...
Oh, he described it, right.
Yes.
Yeah.
I wouldn't...
Which I always loved. I mean, anything that is within a car and is described in terms of a vagina, I'm a huge fan of. And a lot of descriptions coming up in other books about the clitoral pink and that sort of thing. Like, he was a big fan of just describing textiles, the color of women's genitals, which I appreciate.
It seems to be a good band name generator as well.
Absolutely. That's another thing. There is going to be a record based on the soundtrack to Stinker Lets Loose, featuring songs including CB Dialogue. We're hoping to put this out, to reissue it under some sort of production company. But that's another thing. Like, that isn't available on cassette. It's just available on 8-track, never even on LP. So those are impossible to find. But that's another thing that we're looking forward to doing.
Were you able to get the original artist from that, or would you have to have somebody cover the songs?
No, unfortunately, we couldn't find the original art for that. It was just a blank 8-track. But the songs are really good. I mean, they feature, a lot of good slide guitar and a lot of good, Jew's harp or Jaws harp. I guess you could say, just really good country stuff from the shit-kicking late 70s.
There has to be a banjo on there somewhere.
Oh, there definitely is a banjo, yeah.
And you've gotten the endorsement of David Sedaris for this book, which...
Well, unfortunately, he gave it a negative blurb, which I don't know if has ever been done before, but he hated the book. And the blurb reads, the movie, he remembers the movie, too. He grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I guess they showed it down there. The blurb is, the movie made my eyes bleed, and the book made pus run out of them. The two things were made for each other. They're awful and awfuler. This novelization stinks.
And you read that as negative?
Well, he's a big name, so I just wanted to put any blurb. He's the only one willing to even blurb it. I wasn't happy that it was not great, that he didn't love the book, but, I was told by marketing that whatever you put on the back is going to help sales. And I think it did, actually. I think it did sell a few more hundred books.
And you say that there is already a next one in this series planned. When might that come out?
Well, Poppin' It is, I'm retyping it now, so that takes a few months. I would say by next spring, you can look forward to Poppin' It. And then there'll be other books. There'll be, a lot of surprises, like movies that didn't deserve to win the Best Oscar in the 1980s, and also some space operas, too. So just a lot of stuff to look forward to under my imprint, Sunshine Beam Press, which you can find on any AOL.com account.
I'd like to talk about some of the other things you do as well, your previous books, if that's...
Sure.
You had 2 books, Dead Frog and Here's the Kicker. They were compilations of interviews with really some of the greatest comic writers in modern history. I mean, you had Jim Downey and Mel Brooks and Harold Ramis. I reread the Harold Ramis interview yesterday. Was this just an excuse to sort of pick their brains and learn for your own writing?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, really, the excuse from the beginning was just to have an excuse to talk to them. I mean, and if you say to Harold Ramis, "Hey, can you give me career advice?" he's not going to get back to you. But if you say, "Hey, can I interview you?" and then if you prepare for the interview really well, if you show them respect, because it is kind of interesting how many people don't do any research. But I was sort of obsessive about it. For each of these interviews, there was at least 25 to 40 hours of research, and I tried to read every interview they ever did and rewatch their movies and listen to director commentary and hopefully just try to ask them questions they hadn't been asked before. But it was an excuse, really, just to reach out to these people who influenced me, and also it was an opportunity. A lot of these people were aging. Larry Gelbart, who produced MASH, the TV show, as well as wrote for Bob Hope. He wrote for Your Show of Shows. These people weren't getting any younger, and I knew that bridge to another time would disappear. And there ended up being a few people, including Harold Ramis, who I had no prediction. He was a young guy who would unfortunately pass away. But there were people I wanted to talk to who were connected to another time, like Irv Brecker, who wrote for the Marx Brothers, who was in his mid-90s, and who was sharp as a tack, and who was willing to speak with me, as well as Peg Lynch, who was in her mid-90s, who basically invented the modern sitcom. So these are people I knew that might not be around for much longer, and I just wanted to reach out to them and sort of thank them for what they did. Because when they became humor writers, comedy writers, it wasn't like it is today. it was sort of like joining the carnival. It wasn't a respected career.
Right.
But what they did was, they went off the tracks, the path, and they did their own thing. And by doing that, they became very influential to the new generation of comedy writers who are now producing the comedy boom, which I don't think it's ever been bigger comedy.
Mm-hmm. Well, what did you wind up learning from them? Is there anything you could...
Well, there's advice. Every single one of them basically said, listen, I can't tell you what to do as far as advice, but this is what worked for me. And across the board, there are interrelated pieces of advice that most of them use. And some of those pieces of advice is you have to write what you enjoy. You can't write what you think others will enjoy. You have to keep moving forward. You can't write for executives. You have to write for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to enjoy what you're writing. And you can't do it for money. If you do it for money, then what you'll produce won't necessarily be something you'll be proud of. You have to just write for the love of writing comedy. And through that, you might make money. But at the very least, you'll be content at what you have produced,
mm-hmm.
which I think is a very important lesson. Because really, if you get into it for the money and you produce things you're not happy with, the comedy won't work as well, and I don't think you'll be as happy with the trajectory of your career as you would have been if you just wrote what you wanted to write, how you wanted to write it.
Which is more difficult than it sounds.
It is more difficult, especially if you want to wend your way through the professional comedy writing world. I mean, most of that is people telling you what to do and what not to do, but I do think now in this, comedy writers now have an opportunity to reach as many writers or readers and viewers as ever in the history of humankind. I mean, when I was starting out in the early 90s, I could write whatever I wanted, but no one would publish it necessarily. You could put it out as a fanzine, and a few hundred people might read it. But now, if you're a kid who is writing comedy out of your bedroom in Iowa, you can be read by as many people potentially as who read The New Yorker. It's an amazing opportunity that you have to get your work out there the way you want it to get out. Now, that's not to say you don't have to work hard at getting to that point where you're capable of doing that, where you have enough tools in your toolbox to produce, quality work. A lot of what's out there isn't that good. But I think because of this opportunity, it's opened up comedy to a tremendous amount that you didn't see in the past, whether it's female comedy writers or gay comedy writers or whatever it happens to be, young comedy writers. It just makes the comedy world and the humor that much richer and that much better. It's not just Harvard Lampooners writing for sitcoms like it used to be.
Have you found that you've reached an audience that maybe you wouldn't have been able to reach otherwise through your podcast?
I don't know the podcast necessarily, but I certainly think through Twitter, Instagram, and my own website, I think that I could have produced this stuff in the early 90s and no one would have seen it, which wouldn't have been the world's biggest disaster necessarily. But I think now you can, especially if you work a 2-track system where you have a job that pays the bills on the side. If you don't have to make a career at it necessarily, you can do whatever the hell you want, whether it's putting out Stinker Lets Loose or interview books, and you will hopefully find an audience of people who might be interested in it. But that was impossible years ago. I mean, a book like Stinker Lets Loose never would have been published 10, 15, 20 years ago. I mean, no one would have bought it. The agents wouldn't have been interested. Publishers wouldn't have been interested. It's only through being able to put this out myself that it's out there. It wouldn't have existed otherwise.
I mean, do you find that people know you mainly from more traditional media or from less, well, it's kind of traditional media now, though the web is traditional media and podcasts it's all mainstream media now, but do you find people know you most from print or know you most from stuff they saw on the web?
I don't know. I think the web is advantageous in the sense that pieces can be sent around. If I write something for New Yorker or Vanity Fair, it's very static. It just sits in that magazine. Whereas if it's online, even if it's only written for a small publication, it can get forwarded and bandied about. I think that's made a difference. Because before it was hard to show people your work, but now it can just be sent around willy-nilly, and I think that's the big sea change. I mean, the fact, if this book was sold in stores, I don't think it would sell much, but the fact that I can talk about it on a podcast or write about it, and people can send it to their friends who like movies from the late 70s, I think that's made a big difference. And the reliance on the marketing through publishing houses is over. I don't think that, I think it's, wouldn't say worthless, but I don't think marketing and PR in book houses, publishing houses, is effective. I think it falls to the author anyway. And if you as an author are on Twitter, Instagram, have your own podcast, have your own website, that's really the best advertising you can have for it, because you're not necessarily reaching 1 million people, but you're reaching 10,000 people who might be interested in this sort of thing.
Right. You're reaching only the people who want to be reached with this sort of material.
Right, and I don't think reaching out to 1 million people on Fox News would matter anyway, or MSNBC, because they're not going to really understand it. It's not their thing. But if you reach out to people who read the Onion AV Club and who listen to your podcast and other podcasts, it's direct marketing, and it's free, and that's really the best case that you can have. I mean, in the past, these groups, these comedy nerds and pop culture nerds existed, but there was no way for them to talk to each other. So I think there was a sort of solitary aspect to it. I know I felt a little lonely in the early 90s, late 80s. It's like, is anyone else out there interested in this stuff? Well, there was, but there was no way to reach them. But now, because of your podcast, other podcasts, there is a way to sort of form a community. And the community may not be huge. It may not be as huge as the community who watches 2.5 Men, but it's out there, and it's bigger than I think a lot of people think.
You seem very interested in helping people, writers especially, to reach those people. There's a lot of advice in the books and on the podcast. Is that one of your goals? What is it that drives you to sort of help people?
Well, I mean, I was very I felt alone when I was first starting out. I just didn't know anyone. I didn't know anyone who knew anyone. How does one become published? How does one write comedy? I just didn't know. I mean, I grew up in Virginia and Maryland. My father was a dentist. He didn't know any writers. I just felt kind of lonely, and I feel for those who are just starting out, and I don't think the mystery should be as mysterious as they might think. I don't think it should be as unbreachable as they may think it is. I used to think, how does one get published? It almost felt like going to the moon. Like, how do you do that? I have no idea. Well, there is a way to do it, and it's not as complicated or as mysterious as a lot of people might think it is. So I love the fact that if you're young and you're interested in comedy, you can reach out to people and make that leap and do what you want to do. I think it's a great thing. I mean, I don't look at it as competition, publishing or comedy. I think it's the type of thing where we should all sort of go through it together. There's not a tremendous amount of money in it, so it's not as if someone publishes a book, he's not taking money away from me. I think it's like the all boats rising sort of thing. And I love the sense of community. I mean, that didn't exist when I was growing up. I was looked at as being strange for liking certain comedy shows or British comedy shows or what have you, but that doesn't exist anymore. And I think the comedy nerd of the past is now fully established, and I think that's a good thing.
I think the camaraderie aspect of it might be something that would surprise some people who think it's all sort of cutthroat. I mean, I know that there are things that people don't tell me as someone who's interviewing comedians for the Boston Globe and for other places. I know that there's dirt that doesn't make it into an interview. People don't want to talk about it. But I have also found most everybody I've interviewed through nearly 20 years of doing this has been fairly gracious about it and hasn't been terribly cutthroat about their peers.
No, I think that's one of the things I learned from interviewing these people. If you're, and this is not everyone I interviewed made the book. I would say maybe 50% made the books. And if they didn't make the book, sometimes it had to do with the fact that they were sort of guarded, or they sort of did view it as a competition.
Uh-huh.
But the people who I respect the most and who had the best advice and who did the best were typically those who were willing to open themselves up emotionally and professionally to new experiences and new people. You know, when you see someone like a Mel Brooks, or even in a non-comedy sense, someone like Vince Gilligan, who I interviewed for my podcast. I mean, these are great, very, very decent people. Paul Feig is another example. They're very decent people.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons why they're so successful is because they're very decent. It comes through in their writing, and it comes through in their business sense, in that they're not enclosed. They open themselves up to new experiences, and they reach out to people. And by doing that, you can grow. If you close yourself off and become a hermit and view the world as a competition, you're only going to get so far. And I think that's the wrong way to look at it. And quite frankly, I looked at it that way when I was first starting, and I just didn't know any better. But I've since learned that that is not what you do. And only good things really can happen if you open yourself up to people and experiences. And that includes telling people how it worked for you and how it didn't work for you. Like, just as importantly, what should you not do at just starting up? And I think if you keep it a secret, it's not a healthy thing. It's just not emotionally a good thing to do. And those who have made it have not cut themselves off from the world. Now, there are a few assholes out there, certainly, who have made it, but I think the vast majority are really wonderful people, and that includes David Sedaris, whom I became friendly with after I interviewed him for my first book. I mean, this is a guy who I've seen this, who will literally spend hours afterwards until the last person in line waiting for his autograph after a show gets his book signed, personalized by David. It's not just signed. So, that's a person who spends a tremendous amount of time reaching out to those who like him, and he appreciates his fans. And because of that, you can see it in his writing. I mean, it's so open, and it's so open to experience and humor in the world that I don't think it would be if he had closed himself off.
He seems particularly important to you. You had a great conversation on your podcast with him as well.
I love the guy. I mean, I truly, truly love the guy. I think he's an absolute genius, and I think he's the most influential comedy writer for print out there now, without a doubt. I think he'll be remembered in the future because he's writing about people and life, and he's not tailoring it or tethering it to political situation, current situation. It's just stuff that you can read, 100 years from now, and it'll remain fresh. But also, he's just such a mensch. I mean, he's just a very, very decent guy. And for me to reach out to someone who meant so much to me from a writer's standpoint, to find that he's such a great person was a great experience for me. And it's something that I really appreciate. He spoke to me that he didn't know who I was that first time. He spoke to me for over 5 hours on the phone. I mean, who would do that? But it's something that I will never forget.
Well, did you find a lot of these people opened up to you because you had a sort of different angle to them? You were taking a different angle?
I think so. I wasn't trying to get anything out of them. I certainly wasn't trying to put them in an uncomfortable position. I told them from the get-go, I will send you back these interviews. You can take out whatever you want. If you're not comfortable with it, it doesn't have to stay in. And only one person actually wanted something out, and I said, that's absolutely fine, we'll take it out. So I wasn't trying to sell books based off of mistakes that they ended up saying or something that was unsavory. And I think, too, that I did do a lot of research for these people, and I did ask some questions that perhaps they hadn't been asked in a long time. For instance, Marshall Brickman, who co-wrote Manhattan and Annie Hall, he was involved. He was a banjo player, and he was in a band called the New Journeymen. And I was asking, I'm a banjo player, and I asked him about that, and I also asked him about his relationship to the Deliverance soundtrack. I knew that he might have played on that. So I think these were questions that he was sort of taken aback by, that people might not have known about or done the research for. And I think by showing him that I had done the research, he felt he could trust me, hopefully. And also I think he felt he could trust me because I was going to send him back the interview, which helps as well. But I do hopefully feel that they knew I was coming as a fan and not trying to get clicks or get magazine sales.
Well, that's something that can be kind of demoralizing in this business. Every once in a while, you get somebody that you get an interview with somebody you've admired all your life, and you've been watching their stuff since you were like 6 or 7, even. It goes back that far, and it's a big deal for you personally. This is what I find, anyways. But then you ask, well, what haven't they heard before? What question am I going to ask? I got to interview John Cleese for the Globe a couple years ago, and it was somewhat intimidating to think, what question can I ask him that he hasn't already answered 1,000,000 times? Right.
Well, so how did that interview go?
It went very well. He's very quick and very precise, and it was a good interview. I could have been more precise with my questions at times. That's what I came out sort of feeling.
Yeah, that's the thing that I feel too. Is some people I won't interview. Like, I would love to interview Paul McCartney because I'm a huge fan of the Beatles. But what could I possibly ask this man that he hasn't been asked before? So that's one of the reasons I went out for people who hadn't been necessarily interviewed at length in a Playboy style or a Paris Review length interview. To ask them questions that I've always wondered, but who weren't necessarily being asked these questions every day. And I think it's important as an interviewer, unless it's for something that you're doing on assignment or something, if you are interviewing people for pleasure, whether it's for a book or for your own website or for the Onion AV Club, interview people who give good interviews. And just because you're a genius and just because you're reclusive, like a Woody Allen, Albert Brooks, Steve Martin, Christopher Guest, that doesn't mean that they're going to be good interviewers or pleasant to talk to.
Right.
And you can sort of suss out those who might be assholes. And quite frankly, I have no interest in interviewing assholes. There's a lot of time that I put in preparation for these interviews. And if they are an asshole, it's sort of demoralizing professionally and personally that these people are the way they are. But you can sort of suss that out from previous interviews that they've done.
Yeah, the worst I have found are not necessarily the cantankerous people. They're the people who just say yes or no.
Well, that's another problem, and that's a lot of those interviews that I conducted that ended up like that didn't make the books. You do need a bit of an ego to talk about yourself, and if you ask about a specific sketch or joke or book, and they say, yup, well, that doesn't really help you. I mean, the best interviewees, the best interview subjects are those who know what you need and they give it to you. And it's not like pulling teeth. So it is a tennis match of sorts. You have to get the ball going, and it takes two people. And not all interviews are going to work out. Sometimes it's your fault, sometimes it's their fault. But you can sort of suss out that, too, from interviews. You can tell if an interview has been padded, or if they're short answers, and if they're not really detailed. Or what I found, too, is when you read a lot of interviews from people, you'll notice the same stories being told over and over again, and you want to get them out of that rut, if you can, to get a different take rather than the same stories. And literally, I've heard the same stories that I've read verbatim from interviews when I interviewed someone, quite a few people. So that's another thing you have to do, is sort of pop them out of that fog and sort of get them to say something fresh.
Especially if they're talking about a specific project, and you have to ask the questions. If you're writing something for the Globe, like I do sometimes, you have to ask about the new project. You can't really avoid it. So they've got all their pad stories.
Oh, yeah, and I feel bad doing that. And, if I did ask them about questions they've been asked a million times, I do try to preface this by saying, listen, I know about, just say, Mr. Show. I was interviewing Bob Odenkirk, but I do have to ask you this, just to make it known that, because quite frankly, and I know this from having sat through interviews that they've done when I'm not the interviewer, a lot of people will ask them the same questions and not know very basic information, like where are you from, what school did you go to, how did you get this job, that shows sort of a lack of respect, and at that point they sort of phase out. They get bored, and you don't want them to get bored because the interview will become boring if that's the case.
Mm-hmm. Well, you have a deep appreciation for comedy writers, and that comes through in both the books and in the podcast. What is it about comedy writing that makes you so reverent about it?
Well, it just was a mysterious thing for me growing up. I would look at the scrolls at the end of a TV show, or I would look at the bylines in magazines or authors of books, and like, how the hell did you get that? I mean, like, it wasn't in my orbit. I just knew nothing of it, and it was magical to me. It was almost like pulling off a magic trick that you could sit down, and I understood how to write funny, but like, how do you get it out there, and how do you make a career out of it? It was just a mystery about it. There seems to be less a mystery now than there used to be. I mean, when I pitched my first interview book, and here's the kicker, there were very few outlets on the nuances, on the bolts of writing and making a career as a comedy writer. Now there seems to be quite a few websites, certainly, and podcasts, God knows. Mark Maron got big, Onion AV Club, and there's more information out there. But certainly, when I wrote the first book, and definitely when I first started writing myself, total mystery. And people wanted to do it, but I knew they just didn't know how. And I wanted to sort of figure out how to make that leap. That's what interests me. And just, working behind the scenes as a writer, I prefer that myself. I wouldn't want to be a performer. I would prefer to stay at home and just write. I enjoy writing. It's something that I enjoy doing. It's not something I'm doing for money. It's just the pure pleasure of writing. And those who devote their careers to it, it always interests me in how they came about it and how they stuck with it all these years.
Would you do any more books like the first two interview books?
No, I don't think so. I think that's sort of the market's a bit saturated. Another problem, quite frankly, is I would get some criticism like, hey, why isn't so-and-so in the book? Or why don't you have more women? Why don't you have this or that? It's like, well, I tried. Believe me, name an author, name a writer whose work you like, and I will tell you why that person is not in the book. And this, typically, they just either never got back to me, or they just said no. And to be fair to them, it just takes a lot of effort on their part. They have to, some of these interviews last months, going back and forth with questions, or certainly hours on the phone to get a Playboy-length interview. It's not something people are used to anymore. I think it's sort of a throwback. So it is a time suck for them, and if they're not promoting anything, sometimes they feel it's not worth it. So the trouble of reaching out and getting people to say yes became too much, and it just got more difficult because there's more people out there now asking writers every day for interviews.
Well, and now it seems like the podcast has taken over the role that the Playboy interview, that longer, or the Rolling Stone interview.
Absolutely, and there's something to be gained for that. I mean, there's something to be said for listening to someone talk, if they can talk intelligently, versus reading static print. There is something to be said for that, and I don't think that another interview book would, I mean, just as far as the exhaustion it was, I don't know if I could go through that again, but I also don't think from a marketing standpoint that it's worth trying to convince people to read rather than just tune into Mark Maron or your podcast or any podcast and just hear people talk.
Now, I realized I have Stinker Lets Loose in front of me, that there are so many names on the front and on the inside page, and your name only appears in here once.
Yeah.
I think.
Right, and I wrote the foreword, the introduction.
Right. Did you not want to put your name anywhere else? It's not on the. I just noticed it's not on the cover anywhere. Although you say novelization by James Taylor Johnston, adaptation from the screenplay Willard Katz and Jeff Rogers, based on story by Vic Tate and Stephanie Sampson, Stu Calabash, and Gray Whittle, and character of Stinker created by Benjamin Silver. That's a lot of people.
Yeah, I know. It just felt like I wanted to be behind the scenes on this one. I wanted the work of all these wonderful talents to be forefront, and this is something that my family was really upset with me about. I was like, why wouldn't you want your name on this book? And maybe it was a mistake, I don't know. But I kind of like the Andy Kaufman aspect of it. It's like just being behind the scenes and writing under character. It's fun. It is a fun thing to do. You can make mistakes on purpose, and you can play a role like you would if you were an improviser or an actor, and just let that character be the author. And if it sucks, it's James Taylor Johnson's fault, not mine.
And and Stinker Lets Loose is out now. When is the audiobook coming out?
Yeah, the book Stinker Lets Loose is available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, and the Audible audio tape is finished narration-wise, but because of these bigger names, we have to do scheduling. So it'll be out in October, I think. And that'll be available on Amazon Audible.
And what's next for you? What else do you have
well,
coming
right
up?
now, I just finished another book that's not a novelization. It's a book that I found at a garage sale in Maryland that I bought, and I'm republishing. And that'll be out, I suppose, around Christmas time.
And where do people find out about all of this?
Well, that book isn't available yet. But as far as Stinker Lets Loose, you can go to my site, MikeSachs.com, and I've put links to interviews that I've conducted on it on my Twitter feed, which is Michael B. Sachs, as in Brian, Michael B. Sachs, on the Twitter.
And you have a site for the podcast as well, doing it with Mike Sachs.
Yes, doing it with Mike Sachs. No G on doing it.
Right.
Doing it. When you do it, you got to really do it without the G, so that's why I left it off.
The G really slows things down. You really wouldn't get to doing it.
It's like taking cough syrup. It just you get syrupy and slow, and that's the way I like doing it.
Yeah, particularly that letter, for whatever reason.
Yeah, I mean, no one worth their salt who does it has the G on the end of his doing it. It's always the sans G. If you really know how to do it, it's no G.
You can tell the rank amateurs.
I've done it with a lot of people who prefer the G, and you can tell immediately. And that's the type of thing where I'll just walk out of the room. Like if they want to go G, it's like I'm gone. I'm long past gone. And if you want to do it without the G, I'm all in. Right.
The
G, screw you. I'm out of here.
They may think
life is too short to do it with the G.
Well, they may think they prefer the G, but they just haven't experienced it without it.
Well, if that's the case, brother, I'm going to learn them a lesson they'll never forget. Because if they think they want the G in there, let me show you what life is like without the G, right?
Yes.
So once you go no G, you don't go. If that makes any sense. And it doesn't, but just, trust me on that one.
It's intuitive.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for taking the time to speak with me for this. I appreciate it.
Nick, thank you. That was great. You're a very good interviewer.
Why, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yes, true. All right, so do it with no G, okay? Will you promise me that?
I will. I'll promise you that.
All right, brother.
An arrow to the head isn't always a trick.
Thanks again to Mike Sachs for speaking with me. The new book is Stinker Lets Loose, and you can find out more about Mike and his writing at MikeSachs.com. That's MikeSachks.com. If you like this episode, remember you can subscribe and review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. And come back next week for a conversation with Valerie June. This week's featured track is by Randall Thornton from his debut album Lineage. This is See You Through, and I like the energy of it. I like how it builds from the acoustic guitar picking in the beginning as it adds more instruments, and I like Thornton's voice. There's a placidity to it, and it contrasts with the song's sort of marching feel. Enjoy. This is See You Through by Randall Thornton.
The reason I write to you, daughter, these words of your well-weathered father, is I believe you were a gift to me. Unless I've been madly mistaken, I felt every breath you have taken, and like the breeze, you were made to be free. Free to live in every moment, like time is no opponent, but just a guide that'll see you through. Girl, don't hide what's inside of you. My dear, you are ever changing. You know we are waxing and waning, and like the moon, we're becoming new. Though we will have hard days and sorrows, no lady time has been borrowed, and you can choose to hear her whisper the truths. Choose to learn in every moment, like time is no opponent, but just a guide that'll see you through. Girl, don't hide what you know is true, and oh, hold on to your awe and wonder. Don't let them get torn asunder. There'll be a fire that'll burn you through. Girl, don't hide what you know is true. My dear, may you always remember to fight for your heart to stay tender, and you will see it changes everything. Your forgiveness is worth all the trouble, for after the wreckage and rubble, you'll be free. Hope you've forgiven me. You're free to love in every moment, like time is no opponent, but just a guide that'll see you through. Girl, don't hide what's inside of you, and oh, hold on to your awe and wonder. Don't let them get torn asunder. There'll be a fire that'll burn you through. Girl, don't hide there inside of you. There'll be a fire that'll burn you through. Girl, don't hide there inside of you. There is a fire that'll see you through. Let him walk right in front of you.
Neil Young.